yes, I'm speaking for the LCFI and for the Consistent Democrats in Britain. By way of introduction, recently I was confronted by a typical NATO leftist apologist who actually expressed the view that in seeking the disbandment of Russia, NATO is seeking to destroy something terrible, which he called the Russian Empire. And I was just thinking, well, he asked the question, what Russian Empire? I mean, the Russian Empire was smashed in 1917 and its monarch, the Tsar, was put against the wall. The US and Britain and every imperialist around the world invaded Russia and fought to restore capitalism in the empire. And that was the way the Russian worker state was born. If you fast forward to 1981 and after, when the worker state was destroyed, they were happy about Yeltsin. The imperialists were happy about Yeltsin and even initially about Putin when they were convinced that they were doing the job for them. But their sheer world predatory behaviour, extending NATO to the east, gradually caused a rift. And much of the Soviet oligarchy began to back away from neoliberalism through a process of polarisation, which actually is continuing to this day. And they use the technological and military power that survived from the USSR increasingly to keep imperialism at bay. And that's what this new Cold War is about. They've still not eliminated every trace of what grew out of 1917 and the other social revolutions derived from it. It's more obvious with China because the regime still clings on to elements of its own ideology, its old ideology. But the issues are related. This imperialist Cold War, in our view, is still directed against some remnants or residues of 1917. As with feudalism, after the defeat of Napoleon in the early 19th century and the restoration of Louis XVIII in France, just as with that, restoring capitalism after it's been torn out by the roots and crushed for decades has proved a little bit easier said than done. That doesn't mean that capitalist restoration has been reversed in the East, not at all. But it does mean that the form of capitalism that exists there is so marked by its origin in a worker state that the imperialist bourgeoisie itself considers it to be fundamentally untrustworthy. And in a way, perhaps that's analogous to the way the bourgeoisie once suspected its own Jewish components of being surrogates for communism. And I think that's why Hitlerism has been recreated in the Ukraine, in the Ukraine effectively under American sponsorship. What the US is still trying to do really is what Hitler tried and failed to do. And like the third, in Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union ultimately, like the Third Reich, the US and NATO need to be destroyed, to be smashed. And our position on this war is that we are for the defence of Russia, and we give military support to Putin's forces based on the stated objectives of Putin in this conflict, which we consider to be defensive. And Putin's objectives are, one, to defend the rights and self-determination of the Russian and Russophone population in the east of present-day Ukraine, where they're the majority, of the two Donbass republics and Crimea, of course. But not just there. There are other parts of Ukraine where Russians are under threat as well. The second objective that Putin laid out is to denazify Ukraine, which must mean simply to defeat and root out the current neo-Nazi currents that are dominant in the government. And this may well involve the defeat of Zelensky's regime and its replacement by something more conciliatory. And objective number 3 is related to that, of course, is a neutral Ukraine that's barred from joining NATO. I think we think those demands are supportable in defensive terms, but they're not our aims at all. Because we're for a Ukraine that's free of imperialist control financially and militarily. We're for the legalisation of leftist and working class parties, and the crushing and banning of Nazi and the parties, the Nazis and the parties of the 2016 coup. And we're for the expropriation of imperialism's multinationals, controlled by the working class. We're for democratic referendums to be held emulating those that have been held in the People's Republics, so-called, for whatever status the inhabitants decide. We don't support the prolonged occupation or annexation of territory where Russians are not the main population. That would be wrong in principle, and it would be dangerous. But those don't appear to be put in war aims. We could defend Russia on the grounds that it's a backward capitalist economy, not imperialist, and a semi-colony, therefore. But we think that would not be quite correct, because Russia is very advanced in some things, from military technology to medicine, more so in some cases than the United States. It's not uniformly a backward country, it's rather very uneven, and we think it's certainly not imperialist. We totally reject the rationalisation of the third campists, and others have made errors on this question. For instance, the international Bolshevik tendency, as was. It's clear that Russia does not derive its economic strength from the continuing exploitation of backward countries, as does the United States, Britain, and all the imperialist countries in the last analysis. But it's also true that Russia is more independent of imperialism than any semi-colony. This is partly because as part of the retreat from neoliberalism, the degree of statification in the Russian economy has massively increased since the days of Yeltsin's mass privatization and shock treatment. And this statification is a classic means by which dependent and semi-colonial countries have defended themselves in the past against imperialism. There are many examples of this, from Iraq to even Ireland. But in the case of Russia, this is massively enhanced by the military and technological might, in a sense, that it's inherited from the USSR. And we think that's what's happened. And as NATO began to go on the offensive at the end of the 1990s, the central element of the oligarchy retreated from neoliberalism. We have an anomalous form of capitalism here that's out of step with imperialism. Its power to defy imperialism is still indirectly a product of the revolution. And the degree of Russia's dependency is sharply limited by this. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution posited that democratic gains, including genuine national independence, can only be established by overthrowing the capitalists. But we would contend that capitalist restoration does not automatically reverse that, not in a mechanical sense, as both Russia and China actually show. And that raises the question of China. Trotsky himself, when he was talking about capitalist restoration, said that if a counter-revolution happened in the USSR, the new regime for a prolonged period would have to retain much of the nationalised economy. As it turns out, this is more applicable to China than to Russia. But the problem is that those who maintain that China is a worker state have to realise that it has more billionaires than the United States. And in that sense, the position that it's a worker state denies reality in a symmetrically opposite sense to the way Jerry Healy denied reality when he said we denied that a deformed worker state had come into being in Cuba after 1960. We think it's actually sort of like an inverse of that problem, of that theoretical error. But on the other hand, China's billionaires are much less wealthy than those in the United States, and they're not a fully consolidated bourgeois class. They're a hybrid oligarchy that's much more cohesive and disciplined than the oligarchy in Russia. But China looks even less like a semi-colony than Russia does. As a concluding point, I'd say that this war is partly about revenge for Syria, because Russia was key in defeating imperialism in Syria, and they know it. But it's not actually predetermined that they will not be defeated here also, that imperialism could be defeated by Russia. And I think those who say that Russia are not imperialist yet, which is another point that I've heard people say, are also being somewhat deterministic. And we think there's no teleological reason why they should become imperialist in future. It's not determined in advance. I think that we think the whole phenomenon that we're dealing with now is an unforeseen consequence of the decay of the world revolution, and then of the counter-revolution in 1989 to 1991. And it may be possible that imperialism is not ultimately capable of consummating these counter-revolutions. It may be that these contradictions may themselves create new opportunities for the world revolution. And I think I'll leave it there. Actually, that's a convenient point to leave off. Yeah.